Kemi's day began before the sun. In the dim light of dawn, her hands moved swiftly, peeling oranges while her stepmother, Clara, barked orders from the other side of the room. "Hurry up, lazy girl. Those oranges won't sell themselves." The harsh voice grated against Kemi's ears, but she said nothing. At 12 years old, she had learned that silence was her shield. Talking back would earn her more than words. Clara's palm was swift, and her punishments often left welts on Kemi's small frame. Her life had changed drastically 3 years ago when her mother passed away from a fever. Kemi's father remarried, bringing in Clara, a woman who seemed sweet and caring at first, but turned cold and cruel the moment her father fell ill. Now, with her father bedridden, Kemi was at Clara's mercy. The mornings were the hardest. Kemi was responsible for preparing the fruit stand, carrying the heavy basket of oranges on her head to the bustling market a few miles away. The load was too much for her small frame, and her neck and shoulders ached constantly. As she stumbled into the crowded market square, vendors were already shouting about their wares. Fresh fish here. Tomatoes, cheap and sweet. Kemi found her usual spot beneath a fading tarpaulin, where she laid out the oranges on a tattered cloth. Don't just stand there. Clara had followed her to the market, carrying nothing, of course. Call the customers, or do you expect them to read your mind? Yes, Ma, Kemi murmured, forcing a smile as she began calling out to passers-by. Buy fresh oranges, sweet and juicy. But her words often fell on deaf ears. People avoided her stall, not because the oranges weren't fresh, but because Clara had a reputation for being difficult and dishonest. That woman's oranges are always smaller than they look, one woman whispered loudly as she walked past. Kemi flushed with shame, but kept calling out. The only reprieve came during the slow hours when Clara wandered off to gossip with other women. Kemi would sit back, her hands idle for a moment, and dream of a life beyond the market. She wanted to go back to school, where she had once been the brightest in her class. But Clara had pulled her out, saying, "What's the use of school for a girl who can't even fetch water properly?" Kemi still remembered the joy she felt solving math problems, the pride when her teacher called her a star. Now, the only numbers she dealt with were the coins she handed over to Clara at the end of each day. When the sun dipped low, the market grew chaotic again. Customers hurried to make their last purchases, and Clara returned to oversee Kemi's work. "Stop slouching," she snapped, slapping Kemi's hand away as she reached for an orange. "You'll scare off the customers with your miserable face." The day ended like all others, with Kemi trudging home behind Clara, carrying the empty basket and listening to her stepmother complain about how little money they had made. "You're useless," Clara muttered as they approached the small, run-down house they called home. "If it weren't for you, I'd be living a better life." Kemi said nothing. She entered the house, set the basket down, and went to the kitchen to prepare dinner. A meal she would barely eat because Clara always ensured her own children had their fill first. That night, Kemi lay on the mat she called a bed, staring at the leaking roof. Her stomach growled, but she ignored it. Her heart ached more than her body, but she clung to a small flicker of hope. "I will not stay like this forever," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. Clara's words rang in her ears. "You're useless." But Kemi didn't believe it. Deep inside, she knew she had something more to offer. All she needed was a chance. The market was unusually busy that morning. The air buzzed with chatter, bargaining, and the clink of coins changing hands. Kemi's small frame was barely visible behind the pile of oranges she arranged neatly on her cloth. Her stepmother, Clara, stood a few feet away, her eyes scanning for the next person to berate. "Don't just sit there like a log, Kemi. Call out to the customers," Clara snapped, her voice cutting through the noise. "Yes, Ma," Kemi murmured, her throat dry as she called. "Buy fresh oranges, sweet and juicy, very cheap." A few passers-by glanced her way, but most walked past. Kemi's eyes followed their retreating forms, her heart sinking a little more each time. The sun climbed higher, its heat relentless. Sweat trickled down Kemi's back as she leaned down to grab a few oranges for a potential customer. Suddenly, a commotion erupted nearby. An elderly man carrying a small bag staggered and collapsed just a few steps away from her stall. People gathered but hesitated to act, murmuring amongst themselves. Kemi didn't think twice. She dropped the orange she was holding and rushed to the man's side. "Sir, are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling with concern. The man groaned, his face pale and drenched in sweat. His breathing was shallow, and his hands trembled as they clutched his chest. "Please, someone get him water," Kemi called out to the onlookers. When no one moved, she grabbed her own cup from beneath the stall and ran to a nearby vendor to fill it. "Here, drink this," she said gently, helping the man sip the water. He coughed but managed a weak smile. "Thank you, my child," he rasped. Clara, noticing the commotion, stormed over. "Kemi, what are you doing? Leave him. We're here to sell oranges, not play nurse." Kemi ignored her, focusing on the man. "Do you have someone I can call? A family member?" The man shook his head. "No, no one," he whispered. The elderly man rested for a while, leaning against a wall. As he regained his strength, he observed Kemi. "You have a kind heart," he said finally, his voice stronger now. Kemi smiled shyly. "It's nothing, sir. I'm glad you're feeling better." He reached into his bag and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. "This is for you," he said, pressing it into her hands. Confused, Kemi stared at the notebook. "But what is it?" "It's where I keep my notes," the man said. "I used to be a doctor before I retired. This book has everything I've learned. You may not understand it now, but one day it might help you." Clara scoffed loudly. "A book? What's a market girl like her supposed to do with that?" Kemi, however, clutched the notebook tightly. "Thank you, sir," she said earnestly. The man nodded. "I see something special in you. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." With that, he stood and walked away, leaving Kemi with a strange mix of hope and confusion. Clara was furious. "You wasted all that time for nothing," she snapped as they packed up the stall that evening. "You think that old man's book will feed us? Useless girl." When they got home, Clara took the notebook from Kemi and threw it onto the pile of firewood. "If you care so much about this junk, let it keep you warm tonight," she spat. Tears stung Kemi's eyes, but she waited until Clara was distracted before retrieving the book. She wiped the soot off its cover and hid it beneath her mat, determined to keep it safe. That night, after Clara and her children had gone to bed, Kemi lit a small lamp and opened the notebook. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, diagrams, and sketches she didn't understand. Yet, as she traced the words with her finger, something stirred within her, a longing to learn, to understand the mysteries written in the book. "This is my chance," she whispered to herself. "One day, I'll know what all of this means. One day, I'll be more than just a girl in the market." She closed the book, her resolve strengthening with every passing moment. Years passed, but Kemi's resolve never wavered. Despite Clara's constant insults and punishments, she held onto the leather-bound notebook like a lifeline. Whenever she could steal a moment, she would study its contents by the dim light of the market lanterns or late at night under the leaking roof. Though the words and diagrams were incomprehensible at first, Kemi's determination led her to seek understanding. She began asking questions in the market, discreetly, so Clara wouldn't notice. "What does this mean?" she asked a kind old man who sold newspapers. He explained patiently, showing her how letters formed words, how numbers worked. It was slow, painstaking work, but Kemi absorbed every bit of knowledge like a sponge. One evening, Clara fell ill with a fever. The family was in chaos, and no one knew what to do. "Kemi, go fetch the herbalist," her stepsister screamed. But Kemi didn't move. Instead, she retrieved the notebook from its hiding place and began flipping through the pages. She remembered a section about symptoms and remedies and quickly found a passage describing fever. "Ginger and warm water," she murmured, then rushed to the kitchen. Within moments, she brewed a makeshift remedy and carefully administered it to Clara. To everyone's astonishment, Clara's fever broke the next morning. For the first time in years, she looked at Kemi with something other than disdain. You saved my life," Clara admitted reluctantly. Kemi didn't respond. She wasn't seeking Clara's gratitude. Her goal was far bigger. Word of Kemi's actions spread through the market. Vendors who had once ignored her began greeting her with smiles. Customers asked for her advice on minor ailments, and she offered what little knowledge she had, always careful to consult the notebook first. One day, a well-dressed woman approached her stall. "Are you the girl who helped Mrs. Clara recover?" she asked. "Yes, Ma," Kemi replied, her voice steady. The woman introduced herself as Mrs. Ade, a philanthropist who ran a charity supporting young girls' education. "I heard about your quick thinking," she said. "Do you go to school?" Kemi's heart sank. "No, Ma. I don't." Mrs. Ade studied her for a moment, then smiled. "You should. Meet me here tomorrow. I'd like to help you." When Kemi told Clara about Mrs. Ade's offer, her stepmother's face darkened. "Education won't put food on this table," she sneered. But Kemi didn't back down. For the first time, she stood her ground. "I want more than this life, Clara. I'll work harder at the market, but I'm going to school." Clara scoffed but didn't stop her. Kemi suspected her stepmother's illness had softened her, even if just a little. The next day, Mrs. Ade returned with school supplies and a scholarship application. Within weeks, Kemi was enrolled in a local school. Balancing her studies and market duties was exhausting, but Kemi thrived. Her curiosity blossomed, and she soon surpassed her classmates, fueled by years of pent-up ambition. Kemi's life transformed in ways she could never have imagined. The little girl who once sold oranges in the market grew into a young woman with a deep understanding of medicine and a passion for helping others. Years later, Kemi stood on the steps of a university, clutching her medical degree. Tears welled in her eyes as she thought of her mother, whose love had once shielded her from the hardships of life. She opened the leather-bound notebook, now worn and fragile, and read the words she had written on its first blank page. "I will rise above." Clara, now older and gentler, sat in the crowd as Kemi gave her first public lecture as a doctor. Her voice trembled as she introduced her stepdaughter. "This woman saved me. She showed me what kindness and determination look like." Kemi smiled, the years of pain and struggle melting into pride and forgiveness. She had achieved her dream, not for revenge or recognition, but because she believed in the power of hope and education.